Hey guys, welcome to my video on aggregate demand. In this video I'm going to try to do four things. I'm going to explain the purpose of aggregate demand and the relationship it models. I'm going to talk about how it's different from regular demand, its slope and why it's downward sloping, and the things that shift it. So part one, it links the price level, some aggregate prices in the economy, with the aggregate expenditures. And so on our graph, it's going to have real GDP on this axis, Y, and it's going to have a price level on this axis. And we have this relationship that looks something like a regular demand curve, only it says aggregate demand. So let's explain some of the differences. Let's start with measurement. The price level can be a price index, or the GDP deflator, or whatever other measure of aggregate prices you may want. And Y is real expenditures, which is C plus I plus G plus net exports. That Y looks kind of like a plus or minus sign, but that's an I, okay? Anyway, part two, how is this different from regular demand? Well, for one thing, we allow other prices to vary. In a regular demand curve, substitutes and complements all have to have constant prices, but this model has every good in your economy in it. We can't hold those prices constant or it would break everything. Next, we assume that income can and does vary, and this one has to. Why? If we shift along the curve to a higher GDP, then we are, by definition, increasing income in the economy. When GDP goes up, income is up, because those are the same thing for our nation. Now, what variables are held constant, if not those ones? Well, one, our expectations that affect planned expenditure. Another, policy-related variables. What do I mean by that? I mean government taxing and spending, and the actions of the central bank. These are the main ones we'll be interested in this class. Now, we can also be interested in the conditions in the rest of the world and how the economy is doing elsewhere. And so these kinds of things we hold constant, and if we change those things, we'll have to change our aggregate demand curve. So let's talk about its shape. There it is, this downward sloping beauty. Why is it downward sloping? Since we're allowing prices and income and stuff to change, that might mess with some of our intuition, but I'm going to explain that the reason price level and GDP are negatively related has to do with this equation. Y equals C plus I plus G plus net exports. Because the price level can or does negatively affect each component on here. Let's take a look at consumption. There's a wealth effect. If the price level goes up, then the real value of your wealth goes down. Your wealth can't buy as much as it used to. That will mean you'll consume less. We can make very similar arguments about income. If your prices go up, the real value of your income goes down, and your consumption goes down with it. So if prices go up, consumption goes down. What about investment? Interest rates. If the price level goes up, interest rates go up with it, which means investment goes down. There you go, there's that one. I should also point out that if interest rates go up, probably C goes down too, like buying cars and whatnot, bigger purchases. So I could lump that one in here too. There's an interest rate effect for consumption as well. Next is government spending. Some government legislatures might not increase nominal spending when price level rises. And if so, their real government spending will fall. Now that doesn't have to be, but it can be. Next is for exports. If our domestic price level goes up, then not as many people want to buy our goods and we'll export less. For imports, if our domestic price level goes up, then we want to buy less of our own stuff and we're more likely to buy everyone else's stuff, and so imports will go up. Every single one of these components of that GDP equation, if the price level goes up, we have at least one good reason to explain why they might go down. So, I should also point out that exchange rates tend to adjust for inflation, which also messes with the trade. In my class, we don't talk a lot about the trade and exchange rates because it's a combined micro-macro in one semester, and we just don't have time. Now our last category, what factors shift the aggregate demand curve? I'm going to list a bunch here. One is consumer optimism. One is firms' optimism. One is fiscal policy, like tax changes or government spending changes. Another is monetary policy, which can affect interest rates or other banking regulation. Changes in the world economy, such as our net exports and our exchange rates. So any of these things can actually move the entire aggregate demand curve. If you want to increase aggregate demand, so there's aggregate demand, if you want to increase it, that's a shift to the right, to this new aggregate demand curve. How do you do that? Well, you either need more optimism from consumers and firms, or you would want less taxes, or more government spending, or lower interest rates, or less regulation. Usually, there might be exceptions. You would want to see more exporting and less importing, and you would want to see a decrease in exchange rates. Any of these things can increase aggregate demand. And so you can probably get a sense that there's often going to be moving pieces, and this thing might not stay still for very long. So let me close with one sort of more mechanical note. Here's two demand curves and 3 points on them, points A, B, and C. All right, let's talk about the difference between shifting along the curve versus changing curves. This is very similar to when we just talked about regular demand curves. Moving from point A to B is a shift along the curve. It'll be a shift that leads to higher GDP and lower inflation. Moving from points A or B to point C is an increase in aggregate demand, which will mean either more GDP or more inflation, or both. When I said inflation, I meant to say higher prices, but the process of aggregate prices rising is inflation, so it's kind of the same thing. Anyway, you guys, I think that's all I really had to say. We checked off our 4 boxes. That's the aggregate demand curve in a nutshell. Next, I'll talk about aggregate supply, and then I'll put them together. So thanks for watching, guys. Good luck, and happy econing.